Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
What is the Tower of Babel, or what was the Tower of Babel?
There's very little in the Bible about the Tower of Babel. It's in Genesis chapter 11, and it talks about how mankind decided to build a tower out of bricks to have its top in the heavens to reach the heavens or gods. I don't have it pulled up, so I'm probably butchering it.
Yeah, real quick, let's pull up the chapter and verse.
So Genesis 11, 1 through 9, talks about the whole earth having one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. They said, come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So that is the full entirety of the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis.
All right, so starting from the beginning of that, let's pick this apart a little bit. What is the relevance of everyone speaking one language and building a tower? And also, why bother mentioning the materials that it was built out of? Is that just a random detail to throw in there, or does that actually mean something?
Not a random detail. I'm going through the Bible. There's not a whole lot of random details involved there, but to me, this speaks technological advance. This is something that had not been heard of or not really used in that time. This is something new, a way to make a stronger structure that was not very common for that time. It's indicating a leap in technological advances from the civilization. Language side, so nothing would inhibit them from doing things in unison together and building that way. There would be no hindrances in accomplishing anything because everybody would understand everyone with no limitations.
And I'd like to unpack what that portion of what God says means, that they'd be able to do pretty much anything in a little bit, but I think there's a little bit more we can tease out here. I think so there's the materials that indicates very rapid technological advancement. Okay. And then everyone's speaking one language. It's a common culture. And that means everyone's communicating, and there can be an exponential growth of shared knowledge, as well as development of culture. Okay. But the tower. So what's the tower supposed to signify? The one that goes up to the heavens?
Yeah, so when most people think tower, I think they just think of this like straight up and down
skyscraper,
Leaning Tower of Pisa type thing.
Yeah, like this. It's funny because that's exactly what I was thinking. But this just tall, one-dimensional, straight up tower, where this is more likely a ziggurat, and it is more shaped like a step, like how you see the pyramids. It's more shaped like a mountain. They are ideally
it's tiered like a wedding cake.
Correct. Yes. So they're making like a multi-level man-made mountain is what it would look like.
Okay, so what's the significance of that? Why would God not be happy about that?
So there's this idea with mountains, and you see it in biblical text as well as pretty much any other ancient Near East text, is the idea of connecting mountaintops with the divine. So the mountaintops were the dwelling places of gods. So their idea behind this was to make their own portal basically to the divine. a man-made, it's under their terms, they're making this. It is a connection to the gods that they are making a name for themselves with.
Mm-hmm. And I think that does also tie into why they use bricks instead of stone. So the Bible does actually make a point of saying that they used bricks, baked bricks, instead of stone. And it uses those words, instead of. Why would it matter that they use, instead of cut stone, baked stone? Because there are plenty of other structures that throughout the ancient world people used cut or hewn stone to make. It seems to me that one potential reason, aside from just denoting technological advancement, is that it's a tower that they are making themselves. They're making the bricks. They're constructing them. They're baking them. And then they're using the bricks that they make to construct this tower that goes up to the heavens. They're making a name for themselves with the things that they create.
Yep, I would agree.
I think you have to ask why they would want to make a name for themselves in a post-flood world. I think for me, the exploratory factor in studying this was mostly determining in my own mind if I think that building this tower was a military tactic against God on behalf of man, or if it was a form of idolatry or like worship towards false gods. And the reason I think it's important to differentiate that is because we're in a post-flood world. And like we talked about in Noah, you have these people that get off the ark and go and repopulate the earth, but suddenly Ham is sinning against God and his father and has a child by his mother. And so you see the sin already creeping back in, and there is this power struggle, like Cody talked about in that episode, where it's not just about lust and human stupidity. It's also about power struggles and who is going to be the leader and who is going to take over. And when you think about it in those terms, I do tend to see the Tower of Babel's construction as more of a military tactic than a form of idolatry.
At the very least, it's an act of rebellion. And rebellions do tend to be, by their nature, military or violent. It is pretty clearly a slap in God's face, and it's an attempt to build something that stretches up into the sky. Now, I think there are a lot of questions that come as a result of this discussion, which are difficult to answer because we didn't live at this time and we don't know what they could do or what they were planning on doing. But a lot of the questions tend to be, so what? Okay, they build a tower going up to the sky. There's symbolic meaning to that. They're challenging God, or they're trying to build a place where they can commune with other gods, or angels, as we would call them, or demons, rather. Okay, great. You can plan whatever you want, but if it's physically impossible, what's the point? The issue here is that God stops them. Why would God care?
Yeah, so again, we teeter into the conjecture and other sources outside the Bible, because the Bible doesn't explicitly give detail into that answer satisfactory. So we can see that they're doing something that is against the will of God. They're trying to make a name for themselves, which is very prideful. And then the language is dispersed, which they also say they saw that coming, because it says, we're going to make this so we're not dispersed, and then they get dispersed later. So you have this idea that they're in active rebellion. And if you look at the extra biblical or just archaeological research, like Robbins in the Cult Image and Divine Representation talks about this idea that you can channel the divinity or these lesser gods into this space. So they're making a sacred space, and it inhabits this space, and they're using it as a form of control for these lesser gods, so to speak, is what it seems like.
Well, so they're actively trying to influence gods to get them to do things that they want. Okay, but again, that's assuming it's possible. That's assuming their thinking is right. Is their thinking right? Is there anything to, hypothetically, what it seems like from the archaeological records and some things closer to this time period, the more ancient Near East thinking, is it something they could have done? Or were they just being crazy?
From a lot of the stuff that we've talked about on previous episodes and the warnings to the Israelites, it seems like this is a very real capabilities. And there's ancient Near East texts that cover the ritual rites and worship and these certain aspects of calling divinity down for a intercourse. And this eerily connects to the pre-flood Watchers or Nephilim story. And it seems like these people are almost trying to get back to that.
But they're trying to reestablish the way the world was prior to the flood.
Correct.
And there's conjecture there. We can't know for certain because, unfortunately, we weren't there. It is interesting, though, that much of the world develops around this area. This area eventually becomes Babylon. It develops into a series of the great empires throughout multiple ages. And the Babylonians claim that they had knowledge that went back to prior to the flood. Again, just because people say things doesn't automatically make it true. But you do have to wonder why they say the things that they do and what they were thinking. I think that no matter what we're told here by God is very clear. He says, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Obviously, he doesn't mean literally anything. Like they couldn't become gods themselves. They can't usurp God's power. But it does seem like the plans that they were making would have come to fruition. That the purpose of the tower was going to fulfill its purpose. And going off of what you were talking about, Cody, the idea of bending gods to your will, so to speak. From everything that we read throughout the Bible, it does seem like there are two parties constantly trying to get one over on one another. There are humans attempting to manipulate spirits or gods or demons, as we would call them, spiritual forces to do what they want. And then on the other side, there's the devil and the demons under his command who manipulate humans to do what he wants. And what you tend to find is that the devil is much smarter, and so he gets the things that he wants, and ultimately the humans who think that they're getting what they want don't. We tend to be acting under the assumption we understand, and we don't. We know very little about the world that demons occupy, and even less about God, because he's beyond all of it. And so there are these constant attempts to try to subdue it, to subdue this world that we don't know, or to bring it down to a level we understand. And that does seem, in a sense, to be what they were doing at Babel, and we don't know for sure. Like I said, it sucks that there's so much conjecture that goes into this, because we're told so little about it. But we do get to see the culture that developed from this people. And there's the dispersion and the little nuggets of this culture that remained throughout much of the world that did manage to survive. The mentality still existed, the belief that they could commune with spirits and get power from them. That existed everywhere.
We have examples of that in the Bible, too. We know that at some point, and Ben has a great way of saying it, like in the New Testament era, it seems that spirituality is neutered in a lot of ways. But in Old Testament times, you do see a lot of magic, a lot of mysticism, a lot of things happening that were not necessarily condoned by God, but still happened according to the scriptures.
Yeah, the greatest example of that is Moses' interaction with the priests of the Egyptian gods. They did seem to have some measure of power and control over the physical world. Either we assume that the Bible is treating it as real, but really these people were just charlatans who were doing magic tricks, or we treat it as people having legitimate spiritual power, which God is condemning both the humans for using and the demons for giving it to them.
If the Nephilim were bad enough that God repeatedly wiped them from the earth because of what they were capable of and what they represented between men and the heavens, I have to believe that those capabilities are real.
I think you can get a little bit more into the insight of this era looking at Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations. So you have the linking of the 70 nations in Genesis 10, but it also goes through the descendants. And one of those descendants is Nimrod. Genesis 10, 8 through 9. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on the earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So this describes Nimrod as a mighty man, which, using the Bible Project themes, instantly makes me think back to the Genesis 6 Nephilim story. They're the mighty men, the men of renown. But also a mighty man before the Lord. This is sometimes interpreted as he's a man for God, but this, with midrashic interpretation and early interpretation, and just the line of Ham that Nimrod is coming from, and the cultures and cities that he starts, that we know in later times are kind of the epitome of evil. I think the interpretation that it is more of a man who struggles against God's will, which would be the interpretation here, I think.
And that would make sense connecting it to Babel, because that's the line that gets us here. It's a series of people who started rebelling against God. And what's more, even the idea of just keeping everyone in one place, that's one of the stated reasons. They don't want to scatter. But is that really the way most people think? I would say no. We don't generally say, hey, come on, let's stay together or else we will scatter across the whole earth. No, that the reason they bring, I think that they have that specific phraseology there is because that's one of the commandments from God. We were called to go across the whole earth.
I think about like being a parent and our kids, like we have a teenager and she questions some of the choices that we make. And Cody and I make decisions sometimes thinking with the past in mind. So we want to give our children a better life than we had as children. And so we make certain decisions that don't always align with what's popular, because that's what's best for our family and that's what honors God. And our kids are like, why? All of our friends are doing it the other way. And I think when we think about the repopulation of the earth and how Noah was probably like, yeah, God said this was the right thing to do, and I trust God, and I'm going to move forward in this. His sons and his grandsons and all of the people that came after him probably looked back with some resentment on the fact that God wiped out the entire earth, and why do we have to do it this way? And I want to be the smart person, and I want to be the father of this nation, and I want to be the leader and whatever. And then they take over and they try to do it their own way. It's very natural to think with their eyes, just through being a mom myself. Like, our children rebel and they want to do what's cool and they want to do what's popular, even though those things are not always right. Most of the time they're not right. And that just seems to be in our human nature.
No, and you see that thought in extra biblical text. And like before that, I want to continue, because I think this roots in the line of Ham and Nimrod is later on in Genesis 10. You see the beginning of his kingdom in reference to Nimrod was Babel, Uruk, Calneh, and the land of Shinar. And from that, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh and several other cities. And that was great. And Nimrod's status as a mighty man also extends into builder of cities. And you can see this link starting to form with Nimrod and the Assyrian and Mesopotamian views of Gilgamesh, and very similar overlap there. So Nimrod's description, and this is all conjecture, but it seems like these stories parallel each other, and Gilgamesh is the ruler king of Uruk, and also known as a mighty man, part divine, but also a builder of cities. There's a lot of connection here, not necessarily the same person, but seems like some stories are being borrowed here.
It's also interesting. It's tough to know how far back the tradition for this version of the telling goes. But the most complete version that we have of the Epic of Gilgamesh does have Gilgamesh speaking to the Noah of their tradition. So the two of them knew each other.
Yep.
Now, I don't know if the overlap is perfect. I know that Noah lived a decent amount of time after the flood, but I don't know if he lived at the same time that Nimrod would have. But it's not like it was that big of a difference of time between them, if there is a difference.
No, but the idea that Gina covered is like the idea. I think Nimrod would have had a good idea from oral tradition of what life was like before the flood, because Ham, Cush, Noah, Ham, Cush, then Nimrod.
Yeah, and I think Ham had Cush when he was 100, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, and I think that there was a similar gap there. So yeah, Noah lived another, 400 years after the flood?
Something like that.
Yeah, so like he totally would have been
Very
around.
plausible. I don't think in the lineage that they covered that. I'd have to actually look that up, but I don't think it covers that overlap. But
so I'm sorry, I interrupted. Even with that, that's nitpicking at that point. The idea is still that whether he personally knew Noah or not, he would have heard of him.
Yep. No, and he would have heard that what we covered in the last episodes is the idea of the flood and what caused that, and the Watchers or Nephilim being a large part of the decision into why it was wiped out. And even you see this conjecture of Nimrod. It's extra biblical. One of the ones I'll quote is Job and his iniquity of the Jews. In regards to Nimrod, it says, he also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. So even extra biblically, there is connections to this idea of Nimrod rebelling and the reason behind it, and almost wanting to reach back to this pre-flood ideal of their technological advances of those times, and getting back to that lifestyle.
Do we know where Josephus got that tradition from, that interpretation of Nimrod?
So this is orally, there is no other primary text, so a lot of this is most likely Josephus's conjecture, but the Talmud writings and other later after Josephus also corroborate the same story as well, but there's no primary sources predating that. So it seems like their conjecture, but it's a widespread idea of where Nimrod was at.
And it's important to note that today we actually look down on oral tradition and oral culture because we see it as fairly unreliable, and it's the written sources that we appreciate much more. At the time of Josephus, oddly enough, it was reversed. They had a much higher view of oral tradition, and they didn't like writing things down quite as much. I think it's Plato who wrote about one of his students and how his student was always bad-mouthing him because he was writing things down. And ironically, it's only because Plato bothered to write this down that we know about this disagreement. So the reason that they didn't like writing things down so much and they wanted to orally master things is because it takes a degree of mastery for you to memorize all of this. You're sitting at your master's feet. You're hearing it from the master who heard it from his master, who heard it from his master, who heard it before him. And so there's more of a direct connection.
I mean, there's a psychological study that they did that proves that looking at a photo of something that you've taken in an event. So if I went to my daughter's ballet recital and videotaped it, I'm less likely to remember the actual event because I was more focused on recording it. So there is a connection there. Learning it orally and being present in the moment, you're more likely to memorize it than you are if you're trying to record it.
Yeah, and I think we were talking before we started this episode, and the poetry in Genesis is conducive to an orally transmitted knowledge base. The fact that there's poetry involved in Genesis, that's why you hear things like the ABCs, like it's a song. It's much easier to remember something in a poetic or song form. If you're trying to orally transmit something for ages to come, it would make sense that it would be in a more poetic format.
Now, that doesn't mean that you can trust everything that comes from an oral transmission. And I think that we're very right to be skeptical of things that are transmitted orally because it's very difficult to trace where it comes from. But at the same time, you have to appreciate the fact that a lot of these peoples of ancient cultures, they memorized volumes and volumes worth of information. And because of that, they understood it. You're not smarter than Josephus.
What do you mean? Stupid.
No, and if you're a Christian and Josephus isn't a good enough resource for you, Augustine also makes the same arguments in City of God. Like he talks on length, I think, in 8 chapters in City of, don't quote me on that, but City of God, he has the same idea of Nimrod being this archetype of rebellion against God that Josephus has here. And I think Origen as well is another one who has this idea of pride behind Nimrod and the Tower of Babel being prideful rebellion against God.
Also, the modern use of the word Nimrod is like, you're an idiot. And I find that really ironic.
Yeah, it's poetic in a weird way.
What does Nimrod have to do with the Tower of Babel, Cody?
The idea of Nimrod, like if you just look at the cities that he's founded in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, they're pretty much all of the cities that Israel constantly battles. You have the Syrian Empire, you have the Babylonian Empire, you have this Nineveh pop up there, which, all of these are constant staples in the Israelite conquest stories, and even beyond that of when they're in exile and constantly battling these nations of evil.
That's cool, but what does that have to do with Babel?
He founded Babel. Yeah, so Babel is one of the cities that Nimrod founded, along with Nineveh, along with all these other ones that they have issues with.
Cool.
So one of the connections for Nimrod here and that culture is you see the Assyrian and Babylonian empires being formed from the cultures that he created, and the worship of Marduk and Ishtar, and throughout this region specifically, these ziggurats pop up, and the idea of these ziggurats is to create sacred space, a holy mountain, a place where the gods dwell, but also for all of these like ritual events of intercourse and divinity coming down and basically giving the king a stamp of approval. So you have these man-made mountains where the gods dwell as a place throughout these nations, and Babel being one of those.
It's interesting. To me, we talked about Josephus being super intelligent and all of these forefathers of the church, kind of people being very intelligent. But looking at the facts that we know from archaeology and from, what we've learned so far on this civilization, it seems like they were pretty intelligent too.
We do have the temptation from our modern perspective to look back at all of these people and think they were stupid. And that tends to be a defense that modern academics use for any number of explanations they see in the past. There'll be something that Herodotus will say. He talks about ants that would dig up gold, and then natives would go in and grab the gold and run away, and the ants that were the size of dogs would chase them. Wasn't Herodotus quaint and stupid? We rely on Herodotus for so much in terms of history, but the poor guy was very clearly stupid. And then they'll look at the time of Christ and they'll see these crazy disciples. There's probably a mass hallucination event of the disciples seeing Jesus. Weren't they so stupid? They were so stupid they convinced themselves they saw a man rise from the dead. They were so stupid that they believed that a virgin could give birth. Today, modern people know that virgins don't give birth. But clearly they believed that at the time.
Or like giants got found by archaeologists, but they're really just mammoths.
Yeah, you baited me, Gina. Yeah. So I got to have I will read there was a quote. It's for future material. We'll be covering this eventually, but there was a quote that really bothered me. So there's a quote that was on the Museum of Natural History's page in regards to giants in antiquity. Two different quotes. There's one from the Greek historian Silenus, I think is his name, from 200 AD. Before there were any humans on Pallene, the story goes that a battle was fought between the gods and the giants. Traces of the giants' demise continue to be seen to this day, whenever torrents swell with rain and excessive water breaks the banks and floods the fields. They say that even now, in gullies and ravines, the people discover bones of immeasurable enormity, like men's carcasses, but far bigger. They use this as a quotation to talk about how ancient people believed, and it was a very common, widespread belief in giants. And it's all over the place in every different culture. And Cody, we will cover this later. We're not going to go too deep into this. We've already covered the Nephilim and the sons of God extensively. But in response to this, they talk about how in this area there's mammoth bones and large animal bones, and what probably happened is that there would be floods and all of that would wash away, and they would find all these bones and they would just assume that they were human bones of giants. Yeah, building off of this is one of their quotations again from the same page. The people of Tingis, I don't know. Basically Tangier. So modern day Tangier.
In Morocco.
Yeah, in Morocco. Thank you, Gina. Once boasted that their city's founder was a giant named Antaeus, who was buried in a mound south of the town. To test the claim, Roman soldiers dug into the mound in 81 BC. Much to their surprise, an enormous skeleton surfaced, which they then refurbished with great honors. Modern scientists confirm that ancient elephant fossils are common in the area.
We found ancient elephants there, and therefore that was not a giant. It was an elephant.
These people, these ancient people, they wanted to find evidence that this great historical figure who was claimed to be a giant, they wanted to find out if he was. They dug up his grave. They found he was a giant. They refurbished it. They reburied him. Elephants. Sure. What, was it a pile of elephant bones in a coffin?
There is this overwhelming encouragement from both the church and from just politics and science and even public school that wants people to believe that old civilizations, like ancient civilizations, were stupid. They lived in mud huts and they were astonished by the wheel and they were very stupid. And it's not true.
It is very clear that the details given to us on the construction of the Tower of Babel, it's supposed to communicate to us that these were smart people. They were figuring things out for the very first time. And like you said, Cody, the bones of the civilization was the foundation of almost every major civilization after that. It's the foundation of the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Greeks. Like everybody can trace their lineage essentially back to Babel because that's where the foundation of knowledge came from.
Some of these ziggurats that were built, the bricks were analyzed, and the archaeologists found that the civilizations were adding volcanic ash to their blend for their bricks, which was making these bricks virtually indestructible. So we know today that the mix that was being used by them and then later the Romans is stronger than modern day cement.
What you often find is it's rediscovery of old knowledge that they then improve and build upon. That's frequently what you find. The Dark Ages in the Middle Ages is when all of this knowledge is lost from the Romans, and a gradual rediscovery and improvement on it by subsequent generations. And there's an overstatement of the facts often, I think. Like, the Dark Ages weren't nearly as bad. Like, in sections of Europe, yeah, it was pretty bad. In sections of the rest of the world, it could have been bad. But for much of the world, life continued. It wasn't the worst thing ever. But yes, there was a loss of knowledge and understanding. And there are things like the Antikythera. It's, for those of you who don't know, there was this device that was recovered from a sunken ship called the Antikythera device. And it basically is a clockwork mechanism that's got these gears with such fine teeth that it's ridiculous. There's one guy one anthropologist who likened it to finding a nuke in an Egyptian pyramid. You don't expect this level of precision to exist in an ancient clockwork device. You don't even expect an ancient clockwork device to exist. It was effectively a computer that calculated the motions in the heavens that would have been used to figure eclipses and the positions of celestial bodies and things like that. One, that implies that they knew the positions and the paths of celestial bodies. They could already have calculated that. And they also would have been able to reason, not just with all of that information, but actually build a device that could take advantage of that. It has to be very precise. Ridiculously.
We don't know to this day how pyramids were constructed. There are so many things that were created back then that for all intents and purposes shouldn't exist. Like, they were so smart.
Yeah, there are people who say, well, yeah, is demon, maybe, who knows? But the point is that they weren't stupid.
Right.
Either somehow they got giants or demons to do it. I don't know about any of that, but maybe. Or they were just smart. They figured things out.
If you need additional evidence, I'll give you some.
Please.
So bronze was commonly worked for weapons, tools, and ornaments. So they knew how to work metal. They had systems of written languages. So we know there were hieroglyphics and cuneiform. that existed back then. We also know that certain civilizations had complex temples that were multiple stories. They also had things like plumbing and ventilation and drainage. We know that there was a standardized brick size for a lot of these ziggurats. So it wasn't just randomly handcrafted bricks. They were actually made with real intention to be very strong and have structural integrity. And they also had streets with grid patterns. And a lot of the wonders of the world were constructed during this era. So pyramids and Stonehenge are a couple that we have no idea how they made, but they were made.
The Persians also had access to AC. It's the most bizarre thing, but yes, they had figured out how to coax drafts to go through their buildings to create air conditioning effectively. Not modern air conditioning with freon and expansion of gases and stuff like that. But they figured out how to work nature to their favor. They figured out how to use water and get it to where the air would get cool and then circulate. They were smart.
They were smart. And all of this is just to prove, like, this was not a bunch of cavemen that were like, we want to be like gods. This was a group of organized people who knew that they could build something strong enough and tall enough to accomplish what they were trying to accomplish.
I think people get this misconception that they were trying to build a tower to the moon. That wasn't their accomplishment or strategy, building it to the moon. Like, they were building a tall tower to represent, their own hubris and make their own sacred space. The sacred space of the time was mountains. Everybody connected mountains with the gods. And to make a man-made mountain, basically you're taking that control into yourself, saying, I'm a god now. I'm going to control this. I am making my own sacred space. It's me. It's pride.
That's the risk. Make a name for yourself. That's in the Bible. And God didn't like that. That's something that we fall victim to or fall into the trap of now, is I'm going to make a name for myself. I've definitely struggled with that myself in my old job in a church. You want to get noticed. You want to make a name for yourself. You want the attention. You want the ability to be a leader in whatever subject material you're leading on. And it really can be a source of pride that makes you God's opponent instead of on God's team. And that's something that we should definitely take away from this story, because the literal phrase, make a name for themselves, like, we see that in every single generation and it fails.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gina. Tying this into the realm of church history or even just plain old human history today, like what we can learn from this. Like, we have an entire generation now of people who've grown up on their phones watching, very short segments of people doing stupid things online or sexual things online, and then going, you're telling me that millions of people will suddenly adore me? I can make a name for myself. I can become known, maybe forever. Maybe I'll become a meme. Maybe everyone will love me. I'll be immortal. And all I have to do is something stupid. You can't look at these people and assume they were, at least they were building something. At least they had some measure of ambition beyond just putting a 30-second clip of yourself out there of doing something you may very well regret for the rest of your life.
So we don't know the exact location of the Tower of Babel. We can use archaeology and linguistic evidence to prove ideas for it, but we don't know for sure. And there's no archaeological evidence of an exact location for Babel. But there are other ziggurats that we can compare it to. And there's a Babylonian example called a Temenaki ziggurat, which was created to worship Marduk. And it was constructed of 17 million bricks. That is, talk about dedication. 17 million handmade, hand-laid bricks. That's insane.
It's a lot of bricks. It's a lot of mortar, a lot of pitch.
Yeah.
It takes a measure of resourcefulness to get all that stuff.
And this idea of building this man-made mountain sort of ziggurat idea exists in multiple ancient Near East traditions. It's not just Babylonian. It's also Sumerian and Mesopotamian. There's a lot of different myths and archaeological evidence that there were multiple towers built. It wasn't just the Tower of Babel. This was a repeated offense against God, basically. It was something that they really believed mattered and was important for communing with their false gods.
Yeah, and they all have the same purpose and same similar meanings, like stairway to heaven or the communing place of heaven and earth. Like all of these ziggurats had the same purpose behind them, was connecting mankind with divinity.
Yep.
And don't you folks think it's strange that the Egyptians would invest so much time in building big triangles in the desert for dead people? Maybe that means something. Maybe the people they were worshiping as gods on earth. Maybe there's a reason they were spending that much time building massive pyramids to them, monuments that were meant to go up and touch the sky. Maybe there's a history behind that.
There's this recent study, insulting for some people, not me, but there's this recent study that shows that people who are obsessed with celebrities are less likely to have high intelligence. And I know that's hurtful to hear if you're a big fan of somebody that's very famous, but I do see some truth in that. And I see that kind of repeated historically in ancient times too. It's really easy to get into this like fad of an influencer who is really pretty or handsome and really good at something specific. And that's all they talk about. And they just share and they're beautiful and their life looks perfect. And they're the ideal to you. And I think that we can actually use those inferences from modern day influencers and apply it to this story of idolatry and idolatrous worship in ancient times, because you have a physical manifestation of something that you think is God. It's not the one God, it is a God. And it's somebody who you idolize, somebody you want to be like, somebody you want to have the same empowerment as. And so you go and you worship it because it's a physically present representation of what you're seeking. It's just not the right thing. And so it gives you this ability to see why these civilizations were so obsessed, because God wasn't physically present among them, but these gods were. And that falls under the same idea of this divine council and these sons of God who had authority over certain regions, and it makes a lot of sense that way.
And I think there's some textual evidence biblical textual evidence that, one, they knew what was coming because they're scared of the dispersion before it actually happens. So they're trying to make this way to control what's going on so that they're not dispersed. The people clearly didn't want to be dispersed. What happens after this? And you see the Table of Nations in the chapter before, the dividing up of the 70 nations, and that's also a connection to the divine council, the Deuteronomy 32 idea, as well as other cultures. Like the Baal cycle mentions El and his 70 sons that are, El is the high god, and he has 70 sons that are also in control of portions and regions of the nation. So you have this story that corroborates what biblical text says, but also that these people were aware that this dispersion is coming and they're trying to prevent it.
What you tend to find in these stories and also today, there are two different types of people. It's always frustrating hearing people boil everything down to something so simple, but you do tend to see the pattern is there are people who desperately want to lead and forge their own way, and then people who desperately want someone to show them the way. I think you see something similar in this story and in pretty much every other story. People who desperately want to be shown what they need to do. They don't want to think about it. They just want to do it. They want to go with whatever the strongest person says. And then the strongest person tends to want their way, and their way clashes with God, the mighty man of God, the mighty man before God, but is not of God, who clashes with them and builds cities, and everyone seems to follow him. He wasn't building a city full of leaders who were simultaneously all thinking, yeah, let's fight God. It's the leadership. It's the people who they bow to. What's really incredible about God is that he calls for both groups to do the opposite. For leaders, he calls for you to bow and surrender your authority to him. And for followers, he calls for you to rise and make disciples of all nations, to be leaders, to be commanders. Not that's what you always have to do or that's what you're skilled at, but you are called to be empowered by God's Spirit to become a leader in a sense. If you're a man, you're called to be a leader in your home, to be the spiritual head, to be the protector and the provider. And even for women, you're not called to just be docile, while you are called to be subservient. The Proverbs 31 woman is not a weak woman. You are called to be a warrior. You're called to be strong, to take command of your household, to raise your children up in the way they should go. We're all called to do the opposite of the thing that we want, which is frustrating, but it's very real. Look at all of the judges. How many of them actually wanted to be judges? Did Gideon really want to be a judge? He was a nobody. That was his response when God called him up. Who am I?
And he tested God to kingdom come.
Yes. He needed to make sure. And God wasn't angry with him. He wasn't short with him.
It's interesting because the God that we see in the Old Testament at the surface level is this harsh, angry, non-relational God. Really, he's like this patient, tender, communicative God. You have the prophets. Where else in the history of the world do you have prophecy written down? Like, the New Testament is much different, and the prophecy that we receive is for end times more than it is for current living conditions. Jesus exemplified to us how to live, but ultimately, God communicated with people much more commonly in the Old Testament than he did in the New. Even
in this story, it says God came down. In the story of Abraham, he also came down. He said, I will go into the city. Now, it could just be a turn of phrase here, but it's also possible that Christ himself showed up here. That the angel of the Lord was here.
It was within his character to do so. It's not like it's so far out of the realm of possibility.
This was a time period where, for whatever reason, he was involved directly much more often, it seems. For the life of me, I still don't know why. And I don't know why it is that over time it seems that kind of phases out. There probably is a reason. That would be a really interesting thing to go into. I think the reason,
Ben, is that he ultimately came to the earth as a man, and that's what neutered that supernatural chaos that we've talked about. But I think the powers that existed in our world before Christ was born and died and resurrected were different than what we know today. And there's a depth there that we couldn't possibly understand. And the world needed the Trinity in a different way than we need it now. Our reliance on Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit today is more like, God, help me find a job. God, provide for my daily needs. God, make sure my children are healthy. Instead of, God, make sure this civilization doesn't crumble underneath the satanic power of giants or whatever else was happening. Like, it's much different.
You see the connection in Scripture of the tables turning. So we've talked about it before. So I mentioned the table of nations, the 70 people, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, it says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So you have this idea of when this Babel story happens, the languages are dispersed and they're divided into these kingdoms to be ruled by the specific sons of God. The idea was that they would point them to the true God, but that's not the story we get. But then where this connects to church history and us later is in Pentecost, you see the reversal of this Babel story. So he dispersed the language, but Acts 2 talks in Pentecost about the languages that every nation and tribe was represented there, coming to during the Pentecost time to
understand,
to give their sacrifice and all of that, but also the reversal of this dispersion of languages. Like the apostles spoke in one language, but could be heard in every single language. So you have this reversal of this Babel story. And I think that's the connection of what Jesus did and what God accomplished on the cross was more than we can comprehend or see, and why we don't see a lot of this supernatural or divine stuff we read about all throughout the Old Testament and other type of literature. He reversed it on the cross.
It seems that there was also a secondary reversal. So yes, there was the initial command to spread across the whole earth, and then at Babel they tried to stop that, and so God had to force us by changing the languages and confusing us all. And now The good news is meant to be proclaimed across the whole earth, and we're all united as brothers and sisters under Christ. And so we're all called to speak to one another. And so the Holy Spirit empowered the apostles to speak to everyone of every tongue and tribe and nation. And we're all called in a sense to do that too, though maybe not with the power of the Holy Spirit to make our voice heard differently for everybody in their language. But the other reversal, it seems, is the ceremonial law was more or less abolished. That this series of rules and regulations that was meant to keep Israel separate from the world is now gone. And so while everyone is being brought together in one sense, pulled in with a united purpose in the worship in the person of Christ, now there's also this dispersion of the Jews in more than one sense, unfortunately, but also a dispersion of this thing that the Jews were given to keep safe for the whole world, that they were set aside as the people from whom the Messiah would come. And now that the Messiah has come, there's this great dispersion of the Jewish belief and the Jewish culture, the Judeo-Christian values that now go out throughout the whole earth, which had for so long been kept in just one tiny sliver of land for thousands and thousands of years. So we see almost a complete 180 of every rule that existed.
You also see the continuous return to a specific region in the world, which is the region where the Tower of Babel was supposedly built, which is the reason where Eden supposedly might be, which is the region where Noah's Ark landed. There are so many milestone markers in this Mesopotamian area that just keep coming back to that. The world's obsessed with Israel right now, but I think our focus really shouldn't be on the geography as much as it should be on the fact that God is making a very important point over and over again in the same exact part of the world, which is don't forget your first love. Don't abandon me for these prideful things that you're seeking out.
Yeah, and I think that this is where I love Augustine's points on his works, The City of God. He describes the Babel account in Shinar as the city of man. This is the city of man. God has called us to be the city of God. Go make that in every corner of the earth. And like you just said, Ben, the Judeo-Christian idea is forcing the hand of the city of God being able to be spread throughout the globe. The original Edonic idea of replicating and multiplying the space of God throughout the earth, the wasteland, is now coming to fruition through Christ.
You didn't think we were going to talk about Jesus today, did you?
We can't help but talk about Jesus. It's a Christian podcast.
I have one more point I would love to tack on here at the end. And it's for me the capstone of like why I enjoyed studying this story. So verse 6, the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." So a few things that I have to add on for this, and you guys are welcome to share too. First and foremost, it's clear that God knew that what they were doing was possible, and he felt it important to stop them because his divine purpose was, again, to disperse his true religion or self across the entire world, to go and be fruitful and multiply. And the kind of commission that Adam and Eve received in Eden needed to be fulfilled. And it was in the works, but the people were rejecting it. But I also think the fact that it says nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them, I think it's important because God knew that the authority and dominion that mankind has over the earth is important and it has value. And I think that's something that the enemy has robbed from us in our current generation. We don't understand authority and dominion the way that these people did. We're not bold enough to go out and build a tower or make dramatic changes. And when we are, usually it's superficial or it's rooted in pride. And I think it's really important that we remember that the story of Babel shows us that God acknowledges the authority and the power that we have. And now with the added layer of the Holy Spirit through Christ, we are eternal beings with divine power from God. And I think we need to use it wisely. And I think we need to be cautious with the way that we talk about this power and the way that we make a name for God, not ourselves. And if you take anything from this story of Babel, I hope that it's just that you do have an authority to defy God in really crazy ways. And I hope that you use that power and authority instead to spread the gospel message and the true nature of God, and to use it to silence the enemy as well, because the Bible does say you have that authority. So if you liked this conversation and the episodes that we've had recently, we would love to hear from you. We've seen an increase in listeners, and we know that we've covered some fringy topics and some things that might make people uncomfortable. And we would love to hear from you. Would love to know in Genesis in the future chapters if there's something specific that you have questions about or want more information on. And we will be posting the notes from this episode with resources as well. So please connect with us. You can see our website at thelogicofgod.com or connect with us on social media. But we love you. We're praying for you, and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.